We are back again. Now let's talk about what we call site-wide settings, or all of the things that are located under the gear icon here in the designer over on the far right. And this is important to understand not just each of these features, but how they relate and how they can also be overridden. So site-wide settings are all the things that determine how the site, your website, is going to behave. Meaning, what views do you want to prioritize? What time ranges do you want to see by default? What colors? Whether you want a custom logo in there? What you want to name all the various status options for a KPI? Lots of different things, and I'll show you through them. But understand that most of these settings, you set them once for the entire site as becoming the default, but then on an individual object, which could be a whole group of things, or many groups, or an individual KPI, or a chart, or anything else, you can override that setting. So by default, let me give you one example. I may want to have the default range for my entire site to be, whenever I see a trend anywhere in the site, I want it to be a week long. That's how this site is set up. But you might say there's a certain set of KPIs or certain objects where you want it to be a 1 hour trend, or a 10-minute trend, or a 1 year trend, or something else. So you override that on the individual object. So again, there's this concept of a site-wide setting and the entire set of options. So let's go through a few of these, not just the default ranges, but let's talk about a few things. One of the pieces I talked about in the overview of Visual KPI, one of the most powerful concepts we have in here, is something called attributes. And so attributes can be where you put your custom ways of describing your assets or your information. Now, this example that I'm working on here is a power generation example. So it could be a coal or a nuclear plant or some other type of power generation plant. And the way they talk about their things is with this type of language. They have things like units and plant names and interconnects and regions and instances and all kinds of other stuff. But if I was a mining company, it might be shovel types and truck types and which area of the mine, whether it's open pit or underground or a processing plant or a crusher. If I'm working on a satellite system, it might be by beam and CVC and which operator I care about and which service class. So this is where you go in and you define those attributes. And once you've defined them, you're going to see them in many places. And they're both useful to the system internally, but also for your end users. Okay, so that's where you would define these attributes. And I'll show you in a few minutes when we talk about KPIs in detail where these custom attributes are going to show up right here inside the designer. Now, when you go to save something like this, if you've made a change and you have a bunch of other tabs open, you also might get a warning that says you need to close those other sheets first before you can save this. The reason is because you're going to be adding columns to those other sheets if you make a new custom attribute or you've changed an attribute here. So it needs to clear those other sheets before it saves. Okay, so that's a little bit about attributes. Another example of some site-wide settings is contacts. Let's see where those guys are. Here's contacts. This is where I'm going to determine either the administrators for my site or people that are responsible for certain KPIs and put their core information in here, and that will show up right inside the user experience, and I can apply those to any individual object like a KPI or a chart or a table, and that way right in the user experience, if somebody sees a problem, they'll know who's responsible for that piece. So that's where contacts live. One of the bigger changes you may want to make, a lot of people don't adjust some of these things. One of the biggest ones you want to play around with is the Kpi Status options. So by default, we have various status options here like triple high all the way down to triple low with good in the middle, and then NA and unknown and not in service. These are the KPI status options that exist, but you might want those to be different. You may want to name them something else. So let's say for triple high, I want to say run away, this is terrible, or critical, or something else. Or maybe I'm only looking at profit numbers and triple high is spectacular and I love it. So this is where I can rename any of those. I'll leave that one alone for now. Now the abbreviation I might want to put in here as something like HHH for this one, and that's already done by default in the system, but if I've custom named it, I might want a custom abbreviation, and that is used on mobile devices. If you have a lot of legend, a lot of options appearing in the legend, then we use the abbreviation there. Now I also might want to change the icon, and you may know that Visual KPI has a light theme and a dark theme. I'll show you what that means over here if I have the rights to change that, which I do. This changed it over to a dark theme, and I'll switch it back over to the light theme as well. And when I change that, you'll notice that some of my colors may need to change. So if I'm on a black background and not in service, or if I'm on a white background and not in service is black, I can see it. But if I'm on a black background, I might not even be able to see it. So there's some options there. Now you have the ability to put your own custom icon in here. So let's go over to the triple high one. Oops, let me get over here, and we have this library of icons. So if instead of the triple high one that's selected now, I wanted to say this is a tank level, or a battery level, or a speed, or a direction, or any of these others like a fire, or something else that's particularly wrong, etc. I can change the icon. Now these things are, again, site-wide changes, and this is one of the few of them that can't be overridden because all of our KPIs are rolled up automatically at every level, and so they have to have consistency throughout the system. Okay, so that's how you would customize the icon, and then if you want to customize the color itself of each one, you can go right here and you have a full color palette chooser. And you can choose them for the light or dark theme. And one quick note, if you want to see what they look like on each theme, you can just click this top part here, and that's going to change it over so you see what colors look like in each one. Okay, so that's a little bit of customizing the status options that are delivered out of the box. Now you also have 10 custom override status options where you can use them for your own types of status. We have some people using them for things like an SLA breach or something else where it's a calculated status that says, hey, instead of just a number went past something, depending on a data source or depending on some other condition, I want to change that status to something I have invented. The example that I have in here is also a really interesting one, which is stale. So if I was looking at, let's say, the temperature outside and I'm monitoring that closely and I hear from that data source every 1 minute what the temperature is, and suddenly I haven't heard from it for 30 minutes. Well, if my data source is smart enough to tell me how often I'm supposed to be hearing from it, and it can send me a signal that it's out of date, I would still see the last temperature, and that last temperature might still be in the good range, but the fact that I haven't heard from it for 30 minutes would imply that I shouldn't trust it. So I might want to override the status to something like I have here, which is stale. So another good example there. And again, with every one of the status options, you can choose the color, you can choose the icon, you can choose the light theme versus dark theme, and then there's a few other options on status options here, whether you want to show it in a filter, for example. So let's go look at that really quick. If I'm on a visualization like this one, where it's filtered, I have all the ones that are available here showing as a filter. And if I wanted this list to be smaller, we have some customers that just use high and low, or they only use highs and not lows, or they have other things, and they don't want these to show up here to their end users. You can turn it off so it's not even showing up in that list of filtered. You can also say, do I want it included in rollups? And here's an example of rollups. Let me go all the way to the top so you can see here. So in this top rollup, the region Northeast rollup, you can see that this not in service KPIs are showing up. Some people would say, hey, if it's not in service, I don't even want to consider it right now. I don't even want to see it. So don't include those in the rollup. I don't want to confuse my users with things that are not in service. So they might turn that to false. The third one here is it alertable? So some people would say, oh, you know, obviously good is not an alert state, but they might say high and low aren't really alertable. It's only double high and triple high that I really care about being alerted on. So I can change that, and where you'll see that is in places like the watch list. So the watch list up here in the user experience is showing me all the KPIs that are in alert or not an alert of my favorites. And if I wanted not every one of these status options to be considered alert, that's where I can change it in here. Okay, so that's a little bit about KPI status options and one of the biggest site-wide settings that most people care about to change, because there's a lot of different options. Some people also want the lows to be considered yellow and red, so it's more symmetrical. So all of that can be changed and customized very easily, or you can use your own colors. Okay, so let's move on to alert templates. So alert templates are very powerful. Obviously, Visual KPI has a very comprehensive alerting system in it, and you can define those alerts in many different ways, and you can apply those alerts in this templated way. What I mean by that is you can come up with an entire scenario or an entire way of alerting, and then apply that to a certain set of KPIs. Come up with a completely different way of alerting and apply that to a different set of KPIs. And then have a bunch of KPIs that aren't alerted on at all. So an alert template is one of those scenarios. And let me try to run you through that really quick, and you'll see this pattern again. So you can have as many alert templates as you want. I'll go through this default one really quick and just talk about some of the attributes of the template here, some of the features. So you give it a description, of course, and then there's two different timers, the reminder and the time and state timer. So a reminder says, if you have reminders turned on, how often do you want them to be reminded? So if you say, hey, this has gone into a bad state and it has stayed there, and this template says I should turn on reminders for that state, then it's going to remind me every 60 minutes. It's going to send me a new notification. Okay, that's one type of timer. The other one is time and state, and very important. So you may have KPIs that go from good to high and back, and they do it all the time, and they stay there for seconds or minutes or a certain amount of time, and you're okay with that. You only really want to be alerted if one goes into a bad state and stays there for a certain amount of time. So if you put 10 minutes here, then if one goes for 1 minute or 2 minutes or something and goes back to a good state, you're not alerted every time. And so only if it goes over that time limit is it going to send you the notification. Now, these two are some basic things that go across the entire template, and then each of the next sections looks the same. So you'll see as I scroll across here, I have alert silence and triple low and double low and good and high and all these various things. And let's look at each one of them to see what your options are. So here's the triple low status. So for this alert template, it's basically saying, do you want alerts turned on when something goes into this status, or do you not want them on? Do you want reminders turned on or not for this status? And do you want to notify the main contact, the alternate contact, or the second alternate contact for this? And this is how you set up an escalating alert. So you might say, if a KPI goes from good to high, alert the operator. If it goes to double high, alert the operator and their supervisor. If it goes to triple high, alert the emergency status group in your Active Directory, or alert the executives, or alert emergency services, or something like that. So on each one of these status options, you choose these 5 things, and whether you want them on or not, and then you would just go through this, and it's repeated all the way through. There's a few exceptions to this. When I get over here farther, past all these custom status options, you have things like transient. A transient is when you have that time and state set. Let's say you say, I only want to be alerted when something is in a bad state for 30 minutes or more. Well, if your KPI goes from good to high and stays there for 10 minutes, and then goes to double high and stays there for 10 minutes, and then goes back to high and stays for 10 minutes, and it keeps bouncing around between these bad states, but it doesn't stay in a single one of those states for the 30 minutes. Then if you turn this transient on, then it's basically saying if it stays in any bad state for a cumulative amount of the time and state, then it will alert. So if it spends 30 minutes in a combination of those, then it will still send the alert to you. Okay. Also, do you want to alert when it's gone back to a good state or to a non-alertable state, or do you want it to just be silent when it does that? And then the last section here under alert templates is all the things that you want to see appear in an alert. So you can turn all these on, then you have an alert with all the attributes and all the alert history coming right in the email notification, or you can turn some of these off to have a more simplified email alert. And all of them will have a link back to the live trend of the KPI. Okay, so that's a little bit about alert templates. Now let's talk about profiles and dashboards. So I'm just going through some examples. You'll see that a lot of these features have the same pattern in mind, but I'm going to just go through some of the more important ones. So you have 3 layers here under profiles and dashboards. You have profile groups, you have profiles, and you have dashboards. So profiles are a collection of multiple dashboards and the watch list and the bookmark bar. And you can group those into groups of profiles, which you can have control over, and then inside of those are dashboards. So let's look at the top level here, profile groups. Now I might have, in this case, I have maintenance and management. I might have an executive group, and I can determine at the profile group level whether it's locked or whether it's shown or hidden or whether it's for a private set of users and how to display them. The second one would be those profiles themselves. Same thing, these would be various profiles. Here's the one I use, which could be a person, but they can also be a role. And in here, I can determine whether it's public or whether it's part of a profile group, whether it's locked down, whether it's shown, and who exactly has access to it. So I can set security right down to the individual user that says they can only see this. And then one important thing to note about both profiles and dashboards is for each dashboard, or sorry, for each profile, you're going to want one dashboard that is the default. And for each site, you're going to want one profile that is the default, if that makes sense. And what that means is if you don't set any one of them as the default, and a new person or a new machine that's never been to the Visual KPI site before goes there and clicks on the dashboard, it'll be an empty dashboard, and it'll make the user choose one that's available or create a new one if they have the rights. If you want every new user or new machine to go to a specific dashboard and profile of your choice, then you need to set one of them as a default. And if you set multiple of them as a default, it's going to pick the first one. Okay, so that's a little bit about profiles and those. And then the lowest level of this are the dashboards themselves. And you can see lots of different people. This thing's open on the public web, so lots of things created here by even end users. And you can see here I've got my dashboard name, I've got my what profile it belongs to, whether it's locked down itself, and even a start and end time for that. Now by default they don't have a start and end time, but if you want a specific like daily or weekly or monthly dashboard or a specific start and end time to always come up, you can define that right in here. Now all of the dashboard definition, meaning how the information is laid out on the screen, is contained in our database. And if you want to make a copy of a dashboard, you can either do that by creating a new one in the web browser and saying make a copy of the one I'm looking at, or you can just copy a line right here in the Visual KPI Designer and make a new line. And when you click save, it'll give it a new ID, but that saved new object will have the same layout and same information in it as the one you copied. So that's a little bit about dashboards. Again, mostly those are made up on the browser side and reconfigured and all that stuff. But if you want to interact with them and see who's made them and see what exists as an administrator, that's right here under the Dashboards tab. So let's talk about a few other major features. And these are kind of the big site-wide settings kind of things. I'm going to go all the way down here to the features and config side and go to the website settings. And this is where you really go in and interact, change things about the site, change some of those core defaults. So here's the site title. You'll see that that's what appears here in the tab in your browser. What are the default ways you want to interact with things? Do I want a default theme and allow users to change it, or not allow them to change it? If you want everybody to be on the dark theme and not allow them to change it, you can do that here. If you want them to change things like the default distance, whether it's in miles or feet or kilometers or meters, now the user can choose those themselves, but if you want a default one to show up. Lots of different features. It would take me too long to go through all these, so I won't. This is all the ways to control the site-wide settings: cache speed, what tabs should show up by default. When you click on a tab over here in the navigation, or you click on anything, what view do you want? So if I'm on when I click on a group, do I want to go to the list view or to the map view of it? If I click on a KPI view, which of the types should be considered the default way that I view it? Now, all these are everything on this page, and just about everything in the designer is already set up, and so you can leave it alone. All of these changes are completely optional. But you can really control the system down to a pretty crazy level if you choose to. And every one of these features, while I'm not going to go through it here in this training, every one of them has a nice description over here on the right. And you can even turn on and turn off certain things. Do you want to not show the legend? Or do you want to not show chart details or links or other things, targets on the spark line, etc. All these things are contained here. So this is one version of those site-wide settings. It's also where you would change your logo and upload one, and the details are right here. The other one that's important to understand is the features section. This is where you're going to turn on and turn off an entire feature across the entire site. So if you are a manufacturing plant and you're a single site and you're just inside of a single building, you probably don't need maps and geolocation on all your information, so you might come over here to the Geo Maps feature and just turn it off. And then for your end users, they're never even going to see that it existed. They're not even going to see any of those buttons, etc. Another important one is object level security. So this is where you enable whether you want security to go right down to the individual object level, meaning I can see this KPI, but the next person can't. And if we go to a page that has that KPI on it, we're both at the same address, it'll be on my page, but it won't be on the next person's page. Now this one's, you need to be a little bit careful with this one, because you need to go make sure that you've determined who can see all of your objects before you turn this on, because if you've never determined anything, then all those objects would be hidden to everybody and your site would appear blank. But this is where you turn on and turn off those features. So there's a lot more in here. Again, I won't go through all of them, but let's look a little bit. This is where you change all your time ranges and event ranges and chart ranges. This is where you would put in your alert templates, as we mentioned, all of your colors. There's chart colors as well as the Kpi status colors, and then advanced stuff. And let me show you one more advanced feature just to give you a sense for how far you can take this. And that is the languages section. So when I open here, the core UI of Visual KPI has all kinds of hard-coded things in it, like dashboard and groups and tool tips on things that appear and in the help file and everything. And what we've done is get every one of those strings in our entire software out into this table. And we've already supported some languages in here, like Spanish and German and Russian and simplified Chinese, and I think Portuguese is coming, and other things might appear here. But if you want the user experience to appear in a language that we don't already support, you can add it yourself just by translating all of these various strings and saving that. And if you do get a nice complete language, we'd love it if you send it back to us so we can test it ourselves, and if we like it, we'll put it in the product as part of the core system. Now you change which language the user sees on the server side, but this is where you define it. Okay, so that's a lot about site-wide settings. Just to summarize again, you can change all of these site-wide settings, but you can also go down to an individual object and override them so that a certain thing won't follow your site-wide settings. We'll show you that as we continue the training. Onward.